It's 8:13 on RM Breakfast. Our guest this morning is Christopher Hitchens. He's released his memoir. It's called Hitch22. It's a life as you write it, or as we know it anyway. We've all shared much of it with you to some extent, peppered with associations with political leaders, thinkers, writers. A marvellous life to live, but also a position of some responsibility. I mean, led into the internal workings of government even at some points. Do you feel that, does that responsibility bear heavily on you? And is it difficult sometimes, given you know these people so well, it would seem,
yes,
to write as critically as you do write? Pay a high price, I imagine.
That's a very searching question. I mean, I've lived in Washington for almost 30 years now, and for most of that time, I would have really resented it if anyone had described me, which they often used to, as if it was flattering, as an insider. I absolutely wasn't one. I was very much not on the inside and was generally in the opposition. So it was a very new experience for me to find when the argument over the war in Iraq was mounting to its crescendo, within myself, a sympathy with the government position. I thought that in a sense, that the Bush administration had not had my vote. So they were right, that Saddam Hussein had run out the clock on the United Nations and on international law several times, and there was time to do something about it. So I was looking at things for the first time in my life, really from the government, from the establishment's point of view, quite kind of a vertiginous feeling for someone like myself. And I thought, I know what people will say as well. You know, he's really sold out this time. But I thought that's just too bad. I mean,
Are you still rowing with people about that?
Oh, sure, yeah, I will be for the rest of my life. There's a long chapter in the book where it's, again, not an apology for myself, but it's an attempt to explain what I thought the case for regime change was and why I think still, in front of a huge number of people, it's been subjected to an extraordinary campaign of defamation and misrepresentation. So it's an attempt to show, well, even if we were wrong, this is how we did feel, and this is what we were saying. And
even with hindsight, you still cling to that position. We spoke to someone, Michael Otterman, earlier in the week, who's written a book about the displacement of people in Iraq and how many hundreds of thousands of people left and won't come home because home is A, not safe. The quality of life is so degraded from what it was. The secular society that was there is being sort of wrought asunder. And it's just such a divided, difficult place to be. Still worth it?
Well, I understand that argument very well, and I've been a witness to a good bit of it too. I would say that the one reason for proposing an international intervention in Iraq was that the society was already imploding. I mean, remember, the Saddam Hussein regime, which, by the way, it's long ceased to be secular. It was openly allied with the forces of jihad in its propaganda and its actions. Didn't control two-thirds of its country. I mean, the majority of the Shia population and of the Kurdish population were under the protection of no-fly zones imposed by the international community, at which Saddam's forces fired, the protectors of which were under fire from Saddam's forces every day. That the regime lived by divide and rule, by stirring up the resentment between Arabs and Kurds and Sunni and Shia Muslims and others, and by making lunges in the direction of neighbours, keeping the pot boiling by permanent war. So that the regime was itself imploding. Saddam was going mad. He had two psychopathic sons ready to take over who would probably have quarrelled among themselves, so that a ruined and maimed and traumatised Iraq was in our future no matter what. The question was, could we catch it before it went over the cliff? And we didn't quite.
And it remains.
We didn't quite. And
remains ruined and maimed, doesn't it?
And above all, traumatised. I mean, 30 years and more of continuous war and fascism and divide and rule does tend to leave its mark on a society, as did the international sanctions that had to be imposed because of a lawless and aggressive regime. So to blame this on the intervention is really to mistake cause for effect.
Publicly, Christopher Hitchens, for many of us here in Australia who hear you on the radio, on radio programs like this one or on television programs, you seem so confident in your view, so confident in your politics, so confident in your public statements. I wonder if you have moments of self-doubt. For instance, you write about the young soldier, a guy called Mark Daly, whom you discovered after the fact had gone to a war, signed up for the Iraq War, after being influenced by something you wrote. He was killed in Iraq. Yeah. What kind of effect did that have on you?
No, well, I thought having written this chapter of explanation about the regime change faction that I was in Washington and how it actually thought, I owed it to the customers to say what my doubts were and my misgivings and my second thoughts. And these most summarised by the fact that I heard one day of a young man named Mark Daly, a very handsome and brilliant and intelligent young man who had given up a very promising career in California to join the United States Army and go to Iraq, and had been killed in Kurdistan. And it turned out had left a statement behind on his MySpace page in case of his death, which he faced very stoically, in which he'd said that my work had helped to persuade him to join up. So I felt absolutely congealed with woe and unease when I heard that. And I thought, well, I've got to get in touch with his family, but for all I know, they'll tell me to really get lost, to put it mildly. So the rest of the chapter is an account of how, in fact, they welcomed me and reassured me. They said he was going to go. You know, he'd made up his mind, but he used to quote you as one of his reasons for doing so. But you know, you don't have the sort of influence that would get such a decided and bright young person just to do what you said. And they remained very proud of him, in spite of the fact that they were opposed to the war themselves, could easily have done without it, and were devastated.
It's 8:19 on RM Breakfast. Christopher Hitchens is our guest. Christopher, I know it's been noted before, and I know you've been questioned closely before on the question of women. Now, reading this book, enormous number of people talked about, very few of them women. I'm not talking about sexual liaisons.
No.
I'm not saying why didn't you detail your different liaisons or even talk particularly at length about your wife or your wives, but not a lot of women mentioned in the same realm as the men, as thinkers and influencers.
That's true.
Why is that? Do you not have many female friends in this realm?
Oh, no, I'm not short of that. That I think, well, someone else should be saying this for me, I suppose. It's not really for me to say. I do have a note at the beginning of the book, a cautionary note saying, look, I only have copyrighted myself. So I don't really write about anyone, unless they're dead, whose privacy might be involved.
I'm not talking about privacy.
You're
I'm talking
about
public intellectuals,
no,
women in that sphere.
No, in my sphere there aren't that many of them.
Really?
No, there aren't. It's the fact. The same when I wrote my novel, my collection of works about fiction, about novels.
That can't be true. I mean, there's
About
plenty
novelists.
of female authors and writers
well,
and
no, they're
journalists.
the ones that matter to me most, and the ones I featured. There were only two in that whole collection. George Eliot, who I regard as worth much more than any 10 of the others put together, but still there's only one of her. And then, strangely enough, Dorothy Parker, of whom I still have a great admiration. Most of the other authors that have influenced me have been male, it's true.
Now, Christopher, it goes without saying.
But I think you should mention the huge influence that Margaret Thatcher exerted on me.
Oh, all right. Come on. You want to tell that story. We've got a minute left. Tell us the
all right.
Margaret Thatcher story.
I can't
It is
do
a
it
classic.
in a minute. No, people have to buy the book.
All right. Within a minute.
Tell them it might be worth their while.
Within a minute or so, it is worth your while.
Physical encounter with Margaret Thatcher is not something every man can boast of.
No, especially saying bend lower. Just very briefly, can I get your views of Barack Obama, how he's going in terms of conventional politics? You lost faith in a lot of that.
Well, I voted for the president in a very positive way, as well as the negative way of. Obviously, I felt I couldn't vote for the McCain-Palin ticket. They made that easy enough. But it wasn't just voting against the Republicans. I voted positively for Obama because I like him as a writer. I thought his first volume of memoirs was very well written indeed, and revealed a very attractive and thoughtful and self-critical personality.
What about as a president?
Well, then the question is that all you need to be president? Because actually you might want to be a bit more decisive than that. And that's my main worry now, that there are too many subjects, especially on the international arena, where the president seems to think that the problem arises from misunderstanding. And I'm afraid it probably doesn't. With North Korea, for example, it's not a misunderstanding or a cultural lag. It's a direct conflict.
So one can be too tolerant.
I'm afraid so.
Christopher Hitchens, thanks so much for joining us on Breakfast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Christopher Hitchens, and his memoir is called Hitch22. It's published by Allen & Unwin, and he asked me to do this, and I will. It is worth having a look at. It's 8:22 on RM Breakfast.